guys. All right, I'm gonna adjust my view, and you guys, if you want to, you can always pin me or pin the overhead depending on what you want, or go with speaker view. I'll see if I can spotlight folks, or maybe Amanda can spotlight folks too. And then I'm just adjusting my view. There we go. How's everybody doing today?
Hi.
Hi, Ronnie. How are you?
I'm good, Jen. How are you?
Good. Oh, thanks, Amanda. She spotlighted my video for everybody. Yay. All right. Amanda's on it. She's on it. All right, guys. I am just checking the time, so we'll do a little chat. So we'll welcome to the demo for the Circle Weave. I'm Jen from Yarnia. And I am excited to do this because this is going to be fun. I hope everybody has had a really great wool walk so far. Obviously, I am not at Yarnia. I am in my office, which you can't see the mess behind the camera because I very carefully designed it so you couldn't. But there's piles of stuff, including yarn. So today we're going to go through and do a circle weave like some of the ones behind me. So this is one that I did a while ago. I don't know, where's the good on camera? And this is a mix of yarn that's left over from a couple of projects, some hand spun that I spun, and some roving scraps that I had. But you can do circle weaves in kind of any yarn that you want. In this case, this one is done in a wood embroidery hoop. And this is the inner part of the hoop. So that the nice part about circle weaves done in an embroidery hoop is you don't have to worry about finishing. Sometimes finishing a weave can be a tricky thing to do if you're doing tapestry weaves, but with embroidery hoops, you literally just pop on the outside and boom, you can hang it from the metal thing, which this is normally hanging in my office on one of the walls. And here's another one that I did. And this one I did on a macrame hoop, which looks like this. It's usually like a little brass colored hoop that you can get from a macrame supply place or anything else. They're a little bit more expensive than your standard wooden embroidery hoops, but standard wooden embroidery hoops are super easy to find, and they look really great. So this one, I don't know if you can see, I wrapped the edge of the weave in yarn because I didn't want the gold to show through. But this is the same kind of thing. This is done with some cotton and some roving and some chunky and some roving. Super easy to do. Doesn't take very long. And I'm going to put this one in the overhead and give you an idea of what we're gonna work with. So if anyone is following along, thank you, Amanda. If anyone is following along for this demo, what we're going to be doing is, what you need is an embroidery hoop, or you can use a macrame ring if you have it. But it's really easy to find an embroidery hoop. And then the embroidery hoops come with an outside ring like this, and also an inside ring. I have already started the warping process on the inside ring so I could show you without having to go through the entire warping process, because it's not as fun to watch. So what you need for this project is the ring, your embroidery hoop, a tapestry needle or a weaving needle. You can use either. I happen to have a weaving needle. It's just a longer needle. But actually for circle weaves, I tend to prefer using a normal old tapestry needle. And this is a great use for like the plastic tapestry needles that sometimes bend if you're using them for your knitting projects or your crochet projects. Some crochet yarn, or I also have warping yarn. It's thin cotton. It's nothing fancy. You could warp it in anything. I have some metallic crochet yarn, that's super fun. That makes a pretty weave because you do see a little bit of the warp. And when I'm using the terms warp and weft, warp is the yarn, the strings that you go over and under. Weft is what you use to go over and under. And in weaving, those are pretty much interchangeable. In our case, for a circle weave, these are going to be the warp, and your fun yarn is going to be the weft. So we have our hoop, our warp yarn, which is a smooth, thin cotton, linen, something along those lines. You could use wool as well. If you have a fingering weight wool, that would be a great one to do. And then we have our fun stuff. So our fun stuff, I gathered a selection of fun stuff in one of these little baskets. And so what I have is I have some franca that's left over. I have some knitted wick cotton candy. I have a rainbow oink that I made a hat out of. Thank you. Rainbow oink that I made a hat out of. And I also have some gray. I have some white roving or white top. And I like white top if you have any. You might not. That's okay. Because I feel like it highlights everything. And I also have little bits and pieces of multicolored wool top. I'm a spinner, so I have lots of little bits and pieces of things. You can also, if you get really into this or you want to make these for gifts, you can also buy from a lot of wool producers or hand dyers. You can buy little minis that come literally like this, like a little mini, like, what do we want to call this? Like a cinnamon bun, like a little cinnamon bun of fiber. And that's really fun to use too. And then I also have some white alpaca that's left over from a project from years ago. I like to use a lot of white in my weaves, but you can use whatever colors you want. I save everything because I might as well be a hoarder. And I also have, I grabbed my purples bin. So I have a little bin of like just little scraps of hand spun or leftover wool. That's some Noro Silk Garden. That's Noro Silk Garden. This is my hand spun. This is, I have no idea what this is, something. Little bits and pieces are great for this. And also, if you guys are doing this with your bits and pieces, double up, triple up. Use, like if you're a sock knitter and you're using fingering weight, grab a whole bunch of, you know, all fingering weight that has purples in it and treat it like one yarn when we do this. So use up your scraps. Okay, I'm going to show you how to warp. So I am going to take, I totally have my scrap bins organized by color. I do. I'm crazy. Like all of the little ones. I have these little bins from the Container Store or IKEA. I'm not sure which. Bless them. So I'm going to take a couple of yards of crochet thread or my warp thread. I usually do 1, 2, probably like 6 yards or so, maybe a little bit more. Better to do more than to run out. And what we're going to do is you're going to divide your hoop, take off the outer ring and set it aside. You're not going to need this outer ring until the finish. So I'm going to put it behind me here. We're going to pretend that this brass ring is our inner ring of the embroidery hoop for now, because I only had one embroidery hoop on hand. So in order to warp your loom, which let's face it, this embroidery hoop is our loom. It's going to remain on the frame. You're not going to take it off. You're going to tie a knot directly onto the ring. I do a double knot because my knots aren't always secure. I've cut my length, and then it's super easy, very spider webby, as it were. You go across the hoop, come around, pull your yarn through. And I do the loop around like that because I want this tight. And this helps me keep it tight. And then when I come back around, do you see how I'm moving over just a little bit? I put my thumb there, get rid of that little string, and I wrap it around again. And then when I go across, I don't know if you guys ever did string art in the 70s, 80s. This is very much like that, where you're wrapping it around the circle, scooting it over a little bit at a time. The middle is going to look like a jumbled mess. Do not worry. We will address that. So you keep going around like that, going across. If anybody has any questions, throw them in the chat. If you feel like I'm going too fast, throw it in the chat. Anything like that, throw it in the chat. There we go. So we're going to make this like spider webbing. And if you wanted to, you could actually leave it like this and just do a little weaving back and forth here and here. There's a lot of fun things you can do with this technique of circular weaves. I really like them because it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't have any finishing really. You do the setup, you weave, and then you're done. And it's ready to gift or hang. You know, it's nothing fancy, but it looks really fancy, which is, I think, the best part of these kinds of projects. Hopefully everyone can see okay. So I'm coming around to the end, and this is where I can decide, do I feel like I need a little bit more warp? Are the gaps too big through here? If so, I can just scooch things over a little bit and shove a couple more in. We are going to be weaving from the inside of this ring out. And you can see it makes a pretty star. And I'm going to go one more up here. And here is where I'm going to tie a little knot to keep my tension. You don't have to do this, but I like to, again, because I want my warp tight. So I'm just going to pull it through, just a little granny knot. There we go. So there's my ring that's warped. That one looks a lot prettier than, I'll show you the other one, my actual ring. This one looks a little bit more chaotic. I'll put the two side by side. But I'm going to show you how they both come together pretty quickly. Actually, they both look pretty okay. So once you've got your ring warped, I'm going to move this guy to the side. Here's my embroidery hoop. You can see there's a little bit of dimension here. Right here, there's some space in between the two. Don't stress about that at all. And we're going to now get this center dweely bob all together, and it'll be really, really super easy to do. Hold on, there we go. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take, this was our last string. I tied my knot right here, right there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten this center bit up a little bit. Now I want an odd number of warp strings. These are my warp strings. And the reason I want an odd number is because I'm going to be going around in a spiral when I'm weaving. And if you remember, weaving is just like we did in like pre-K when you made that placemat out of paper, over, under, and then the next way you go under, over. Same thing. So in this case, you go over, under. You just keep going around and around and around in a circle. And so if you're doing that, you need an odd number of warp strings. Otherwise, you'll just have to skip one. So because I'm doing an odd number of warp strings, this loose string is going to, I'm going to pretend this double guy here is 1. It's 1. It's not 2. It's 1. So I'm going to take my loose string, I threaded it on my tapestry needle, and what I'm going to do is take a couple of little stitches through the center. So if you notice, I don't go all the way to the end. I'm going into the center, and I'm going to come up in this gap here, and I'm going to pull tight. See how that already comes together? Loose, tight. Don't be afraid to yank on it. Now, if I let go of this, it'll come undone again. So I'm going to take a couple more stitches through the center and just go, and lost my needle, whatever. Go around like that. See how that pulls tight? And I just want to even it up a little bit. So I'm going to continue. The more stitches you take at this center part, kind of doing little back stitches over and under to make this wagon wheel shape, the snugger it will be at the ends. So I'm going to take my time here and just do a couple around. Keep in mind, you're going to see this center bit of the weave. So if you see, I'm just going in between and I'm kind of snugging it up. And now what I'm looking at when I'm doing it is I'm looking for pretty, right? I want to see, I want at least one side of this to look nice. The other side, nobody cares about. That's the back. That's going to be against the wall. Nobody will see. So I think that looks pretty good right here. I'm going to show the other side. The other side doesn't look as good. But after you do this snugging up, check both sides to make sure that you're working with the side that you want to be working with. Because you can't really go back. I mean, you can go back and unpick it, but nobody wants to unpick it. I don't like unpicking. Same with knitting. I don't like ripping. Okay, so I decide this is going to be my front. So now I'm going to actually start weaving. Now we're going to do the over under. And now we're going to see if I counted right, which I may not have, and I'll show you how to adjust so you have an over under that works. So I'm going to pick one warp thread and come up that spoke. I'm still using this warp thread to weave the center. You could change your thread to do the center weave, but I actually think this ties in nicely and it gives you a little bit of a focal point. So I'm going to go over that guy and under the next one. Now at this point, I have my finger on the back, and the reason I have my finger on the back is because my yarn is not fully secure. My warp yarn is not fully secure. So I'm going over and under, and I'm just yanking it down so you can see I went over this guy, going under this guy. And you can do it a little bit loose and then snug it up because you're doing this on a frame. On a frame, you don't have to worry about pulling in your edges too much, or I don't know if anybody's ever done a weave, a tapestry weave, or played around with weaving on a rectangular loom and had your edges come in like an hourglass. You can't do that here. It will never come in like an hourglass because you have a nice hard frame. Okay, so we're coming around to the start a little bit, and I'll see if I can show you. I'm still going over and under. Our basic over-under weave. This is called a tabby weave. Now, I'm not sure if you guys can see this. I just went under this guy. I'm about to go over this guy. And then I'm going to go under this little man right here. And if you see, last time I went over that guy. Hopefully everyone can see. So I did do it right. Shockingly, there are a number of times where I have not done it right. So if that is the case, you see each of these warp threads are doubled. What you can do is just split them and go over one and under the other if you need to, if it's not running into the way that you need it to be. So the only thing to remember, guys, is that you want to go over the ones, over the warp threads that you went under before. You're alternating. That over, under, and then under, over, the next row is called plain weave or tabby weave, like the cat. And that you can do an entire weave in plain weave and tabby weave and have it come out gorgeous. I'm also going to show you a couple of other weave patterns that you can do, including some really fun ones that really make a distinct look and that people are like, ooh, how'd you do that? So if you can see, I'm just going over under a whole bunch. I'm not worrying about packing my yarn down. You can see there's a little bit of space in there, but you can also just scooch it down with your needle. And that's the easiest way I found to do this for these circle weaves, is to just scooch it down, pack it in with your needle. This type of tapestry weaving is called weft-faced weaving. And what that means is that you won't see most of the warp strings unless you really want to. So we're going to mostly see our fun, pretty yarn, even though we're still working in our boring warp yarn right now. I shouldn't say boring. White's not always boring. And hey, if you're using that metallic crochet thread, you could use a color crochet thread. You could use embroidery thread if you wanted to, and if you had it on hand, that would work too. I would probably, if I were using like embroidery thread, I would probably use all 6 strings of embroidery thread, just because I want the strength and the gloss a little bit. So you see how I'm getting this little medallion in the middle? And the farther out I get, the easier it is for me to go over and under several strands at once. See how that works? And then I'm just going to yank on it. And then at a certain point, I'm going to decide that I'm done with my warp thread, or depending on how much warp thread, oh, I take it back. If you look here, I don't know if you guys can see, I went over and under, went over the same thing twice. I am going to leave that for now and just get back on track because it's not super noticeable. If you did several rounds where you went over and under the same strands, it would not look right. You would see more of the warp than you would the weft. So just double check every so often that you're going over and under, and then the next round you're going under and over. Okay. So depending on how much warp yarn I have left, I cut, I don't know, 8 feet, 10 feet, maybe. I wing it. So I'm going to do a little bit more of my circle, and then I'm going to switch to a different yarn. The other thing I wanted to let you guys know is that if you wanted to do an off-center weave, this center bit does not need to be in the center. And the way that you do that is that when you're doing that stitching over and under to pull it into a spider web from like kind of that string art star, just scooch, do that slightly over and slightly off center, and then you can have an off center weave. So it'll look less like a target and more like maybe like an egg. Almost, you know, like a fried egg. I'm not sure if that's a great comparison for a weaving, but it is what it is. Okay, so when I decide that I'm done with this warp weave, I am going to fasten it off. Now, I don't know if anyone has ever taken a class with me for knitting. You know that I'm against knots in knitting, but in weaving it's great. So I fully give you permission to use knots. Okay, so this is my front, this is my back. I'm going to go and pull my yarn through the back. There we go, pull it tight. I'm going to trim it a little bit, but I'm not going to trim it super close. I just want to trim it so it's out of the way, and I can come back and either weave that in or tie a knot later. So I'm done with my warp thread. I saw there was a question in the chat. Can you do the same process for attaching your string with a rectangular frame if you want to do a traditional weaving project? Yes, you can. However, if you want to do a traditional weaving project that lives on a rectangular frame, then you can do this kind of over the frame. If you want to cut it off of the frame, I recommend that you warp it the same way, or you even just wrap it around. You don't have to do this little wrap around. You just go up over the rectangular frame. But then you'll need to cut it off at the very end, and you will have to be a little bit more patient and careful with your tension, because it'll come in like an hourglass if you're not. But if you want to keep it on the frame, you can totally do that. You could do this on, if you could find like a triangular wire frame, or a triangular, what's the word I'm looking for, wreath frame, you could do a weaving on one of those and make it a triangle. It's super, you could do it like that super easily. Okay, our next yarn, I am going to cut a length of the rainbow yarn. You don't need much, a couple of yards, not even. I'm going to double this guy up because I want it to look thicker than it is. This is a worsted weight. Maybe it's a DK. I don't actually remember. But in this case, I want it to be a bit thicker, and I'm going to do a plain weave as well. And here's a nice little trick if you're going to do a doubling up, or if you're using fingering weight yarn and tripling up. I have one length. I'm looping it over one of my warp yarns, and I'm threading both loose ends through my needle. See? So now I have it attached, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go over, under, over, under, over, under. In this case, I want to just take a look and see where I'm at. This last one here, I went under so I can go over it. And yes, I am going, last time I think I was going counterclockwise. This time I'm going clockwise. You can mix it up. It's your weaving. So I'm still going to go under, over, under, and just make sure I'm doing the opposite when I come back around. Take a look. Sometimes it's fiddly. There we go. And in this case, this is a rainbow yarn with a white base. My colors happened to kind of match up on both strands. That's dumb luck. If it didn't, it would just look a little bit different. So I'm going to weave until I'm at the end of this yarn. You can see I'm going over and under without drawing tight. And then I'm going to pull tight. See how that looks? And it grows pretty quickly, especially as you get your thicker yarn. Like your warp yarn should be probably the thinnest yarn you work with, unless you want a really fine gauge one. What I like to do is I like to kind of do like a fine gauge in the center for a little bit to kind of establish the weave. And then I like to go into the puffy stuff. So you'll see. So you see, as I pull tightly with my warp thread, I'm also scooching down a little bit. Sorry, I keep moving the thing. Scooching it down with my needle. And when I do that, my warp thread disappears underneath the weft. So again, I'm still doing a tabby, which is over under. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's the simplest weave. If I wanted to mix it up, I could go over 2, under 1. And you could go over 2, under 2. Especially at the beginning, if you have a lot of warp threads, you can go over 2, under 2. it makes for a different look. And actually, I'll probably do that on the next yarn. So I'm going over 2, under 2. And I'm not worried in this case about my yarn twisting. I actually kind of like the way that looks because it kind of emphasizes the color choices a bit. But you could also do whatever you want. The nice thing about this is that you will never get 2 weaves alike. So you see I'm pulling and I'm pulling tight. I also like to really pack in my yarn on the weaves. If you're running short of yarn for whatever reason, or if you're using a sparkly warp or a colored warp, you could not pull so tight. Now, if you look right here, again, I'm off 1 for whatever reason. So I'm going to undo mine. You can look and see I went over and under, but it's not. I went over when I should have gone under and under when I should have gone over. It's not that big of a deal. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to split these warp threads, this pair of warp threads. I'm going to go in between them to get myself back on track. And you can kind of just do that at random. If you wanted to split all of your warp threads, you could split all of your warp threads and have it really kind of fine gauge pack down. Again, this is the Tabby Weave or plain weave. And there's a couple of other different weaves that, again, I'm back off track. Oh, whatever. Let me show you a sumac. And I'm going to do this with the yarn that I have currently. Sumac is what makes the, and this guy, so this, see this braid look? This is plain weave. This is sumac. So that sumac is a different type of weave than plain, but it's very straightforward. What sumac is wrapping your weft yarn, your pretty yarn, around the warp yarn and then going backwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and show you a little bit of sumac to give a little bit of texture. It's a textural weave, and I'm getting my tail out of there for you. It's a textural weave. So I am going to go over 2 warp threads, 1, 2, and I'm going to come up back 1, come up this guy here. And I'm going to do that all the way around. So if I have, here's my start point. I'm going to go over 2, 1, 2. And I'm going to come up between them. And you can change these numbers all you want, but start with an over 2, back 1. 1, 2. Back 1. So you can see I'm wrapping this yarn around, and it makes this kind of dash or an angle, half of a braid almost, and then back 1, going over 1, over 2 into that space, come up 1. So can you see the texture difference between the 2 of them? I like doing some weaves all in sumac. The one thing I will tell you, if you're doing a traditional rectangular tapestry weave and you're doing sumac, you need to put some tabby plain weave in between your lines of sumac, otherwise it's going to lose your structure. In a frame weave like this guy, where the structure is provided by the embroidery thread or the hoop, by the embroidery hoop, or your macrame hoop, you don't have to worry about that. You could do sumac the whole way, and Bob's your uncle. So I'm going all the way around, and if you notice, these are kind of angled dashes because I'm going clockwise. They're kind of sloping from the top down to the right. Now I can keep going that direction, or I could flip it and make a braid, which I think I might do. So I'm coming around to where I was before. And you don't have to use a needle for this. I find it easier to control right now, my yarn with a needle. I have this little raised ridge. Check that out. And you can see I'm adding twist to my yarn, so it's getting tangly. I'm cool with that. I think it looks neat. If you're not cool with that, just untangle it. You can see it's all twisty. Over 2 and back 1, and I'm at my end where I'm going to go over 2. I'm back to where I began. There's my little ridge of sumac. Now, if I wanted to make a braid, I'm going to come up my back 1, and I'm going to go the other way. So before I was going clockwise, now I'm going to go counterclockwise. I'm going to go 1, 2, back 1, 1, 2, back 1. Can you guys see the braid coming up? Over 2, back 1. And this really covers your warp thread. So you don't see your warp thread at all, which makes sense because you're wrapping it around. And I'm a big fan of sumac. I think it's a fun one to do. I'm actually just going to take the needle out right now because I'm at the end. And I'm just going to show you how I do it with my fingers. This is also a great craft to do with kids or teenagers because it's relatively quick. They can't lose interest very quick. In this case, I'm skipping now to, I went over 1, 2, 3, and it makes a bigger dash. That's what that would look like. I'm actually going to go back to over 2, back 1. As you go out farther on the wagon wheel of your thing, you notice the spaces get bigger. You're going to want to bump up some of your stitches and some of your yarn. I like to start finer and go heavier as I go. And that just helps me fill the space. Again, I'm over 2, back 1. So you see, I have a nice little braid. Now, I also like I like symmetry, and I like the circle to be even, but sometimes it's fun to do little crescents. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit more sumac with this yarn, but I'm just going to double back. And I'm going to go over 2. I stopped in the middle. So unlike knitting or crochet, it's a little bit closer to crochet, where crochet you can just stop in the middle and do something different, go back the other way. Knitting, if you do that, you get holes, unless you're doing short rows. But in weaving, you can really just kind of weave wherever you want. So in this case, I'm thinking because of the way the colors are going, I might want to stack my purples on top of my blues a bit more. So you can see I went back and forth. I'm going to go back again. And just go back and forth a little bit and build up that one side to make it be a little bit asymmetric and have a little bit of motion. And then I'm going to move to some roving to show you guys what roving looks like. Roving looks really cool. Or wool top looks really cool. You can also get that look with some really chunky yarns. Makes for a very similar look. You can see I'm coming to the end of my thread, my yarn, but that's okay because I am in a good place. Here's one way to fasten it off when you're doing sumac. If you see where I am, I came up, I did my up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck it in underneath my sumac line like that, and it's a little knot. And I have my tail at the end. So you can see I have my little asymmetric dwelly bob. Now I'm going to pick some roving. I'm looking at some of the colors that I grabbed. And I am going to be super boring because I have a lot of color going on. I'm going for the white, but I'll come back to the color. I'll come back to the color. So with the roving, don't cut roving. If you have any that you're working with, just pull on it to attenuate it. And I'm going to pull a chunk off. So you see how I have that nice wispy edge. Going to give it a little twist. Nice and wispy, but you don't want to cut it. And roving, when you're working with roving, it's easier to not use a needle. Roving is unspun wool that you use for spinning. You can go into yarn stores that have spinning supplies. Yarnia has some. We have fiber available, and you can buy wool roving, wool top. And if you want to, you can also check out independent dyers often sell bits and bobs that are left over of roving and kind of grab bags and stuff. So if you just want it for weaving, that's a good place to do. Or you could buy something like, we have some at Yarnia, we have some of the, why can't I think of the name? Sweet Georgia sock blanks that have 4 different colorways and smaller balls. It's a great way to play with roving and to play with wool. Plus it's fun and fluffy. It's all like poofy. It's like a bunny, but a sheep. So I'm going to do some sumac with this roving. And the nice thing about roving is that you kind of just tuck it where it needs to be. I'm going under one pair of warp and I'm tucking it in between to secure it. I'm just shoving it down like that. Now for this, I'm going to go around, I'm going to go over one and up one. So I'm going over my one warp thread like this. And then I'm going to come back almost like a back stitch. Like that. So I can do that and go over one. And then I'm going to.
So we can see what you're doing.
Oh, sorry. Is it not highlighted? Hold
No.
on. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, let's see. There we go. Okay. So with the roving, I went over one and I'm going to come back one. And I'm just doing this to secure it. There's no wrong or right. And in this case, I am going to go 1, 2. So you can see how it gets super poofy. I'm going to go back 1, 1, 2, over 2, and up 1. I'm going to smush it down, over 2. And this is a slightly uneven piece of roving or of top, which I really like because I like the variation of texture. Over 2, and you can see how it fills up. I'm not pulling super tight on this. Up 1, over 2. Again, you're never going to get this through a tapestry needle, so don't try. Just use your fingers. Back 1, over 2, up 1. I'm at the tail. And get those little tails in the back. up one. So you can see how this can really give you a nice bit of texture. I'm at the very tail end of the roving, and what I'm going to do, you can see, I'm going to go and just wrap it through that double warp and yank it down. It'll get locked in when I do my next round. So you see how it gets super puffy right there. Now I'm going to take some of my Franca, which is a super bulky yarn that we have at Yarnia. This I may have made one of the store samples out of this Franca. I think it's Party is the colorway. So it's just a little ball of super bulky that I had left over. This I am going to use in the yarn. And I am going to do a little bit more asymmetric and fill in over here. And again, to start my yarn, I'm just coming up in my hole. Just going to hold my tail behind so I get done. Now you see, like, here's where I had a sumac start, and here's where I had a sumac start, and here's where I had a sumac start. I'm not worrying about that. I'm just going to go over and under and just go right over it, because you can make asymmetric shapes really easily with weaving. Little crescents. You can stop in the middle of your row. I'm trying not to get my tail there. You can stop in the middle of your row on a circle weave and just go back and forth for a little bit. Get those little buggers out of the way. And I'm going to go right over my sumac roving. And I'm, again, doing plain weave right here. I am just winging it. I'm just thinking, what color looks good? What should I do next? What do I want to do? I think I'm going to stop here and go back the other way. I could keep going around like that, but I think I'm going to stop and fill in a little bit and kind of build up that crescent. I'm caught on the table. So this is why it's great for scraps, because you only really need, for some colors, you only might need a yard, not even a yard, just like a little bit of length. So, you know, what you might normally just be like, well, what am I going to do with this shorty little bit left over from, you know, a hat? Not even enough for a pom-pom. You just need a couple of feet to make something really cool. So in this case, I'm going to stop a little short of where I started. So you can see I keep building up what I'm doing, going over and under. And over and under, and over and under. Or I'm doing my sumac, which is going over two, back under one. One way to think of it is that if you're a sewer, if you've done embroidery at all, sumac is like back stitch, and tabby weave is running stitch, right? Up, down is tabby weave. I keep getting caught on the corner of my table. And sumac is back stitch, where you go up and back. You go forward and then you go back. Then you go forward and you go back. And you can do all different kinds of weaving. There's another kind of weave that's based on the up, down, running stitch, plain weave tabby called twill, that's over two, under one. And the way that tabby stacks up makes a different texture. And that's a fun one to play with. You could go over 3 warps and under 1. You could go over 4 warps in under 1. Sorry, I just shook my overhead camera. So in this case, I decided to go all the way around, mostly because that tail was bugging me. Might focus off a little bit. Come up a little. How's that? Is that a little bit better, I hope? There we go. So this is, I'm just going to keep going around. So you can see with the chunky yarn, the plain weave looks a little bit different. It looks almost like a flatter version of sumac. And as your warp threads get farther apart, kind of the dashes get farther apart. I don't know how well you can see. We're kind of at that transition where they're thinner to farther. And so you can play around with that too, with finer yarns or heavier yarns. You can start splitting your warp threads, because remember, each warp thread we have here is double. So if you want it to be packed tighter than it currently is, you can start treating each warp thread like 2. And that's a good way if you're using a finer thread or finer yarn at the very end. But again, I like to use the super bulkies. I like to start fine and get bigger. I'm really liking, I mean, I love this color, which is a shocker to anyone who knows me, that I love the teal. So, but I think I need to balance it with maybe some purple and some white so it doesn't overwhelm. But I think I'm just going to go to the end of this thread and leave it. The other nice thing about weaving, guys, especially if you're doing tapestry weaving, which is not meant to be kind of structural the same way that actual, weaving is, like you're not making a fabric, this is for pretty and not for function in the same way, is that you don't really need to worry about the ends too much. You can knot them, you can shove them in, you can leave them loose, because it's not like you're going to be wearing this. Although you could make like cute little earrings out of little baby hoops, but even then. So I am at my ends going faster, faster. Let's see. You can see how quickly it starts to fill up. There we go. See, I have my little, it almost looks like a little puffy cloud over the sea, something like that. It's a fun way to play with color and play with yarn. There we go. I'm going to pull it just a little bit snugger. You can leave it loose or snug. I think my tail is caught right there, so I'm going to shove that down. There we go. Now it's addressed. Can't see it. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to split this warp yarn to just snug it up. Leave it in the back. There we go. And let's think. Should we do this one?
Can't hear you, Jen.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you were on mute.
Yeah, I didn't get a text, my computer crashed.
Ah,
But what I'm going to do is, this is my overhead camera. So I'm going to put it on and I'm just going to have the audio on like that. So hopefully I will show you the last little bit of, because we're about 5 minutes from the end, and I'll show you how to finish off the weave, which is the easiest thing in the world. So hold on a second. I'm going to swap my camera. There we go. You guys see okay? Can you guys see all right?
yes.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I am going to go with this one. And I'm going to do some straight tabby weave with this baby to show you how you can manipulate it. I am not pulling tight. I'm actually kind of puffing up my over. I'm going to pull tight at my under, and I'm going to puff up my over. And I'm going to go back and forth like that. So you can see with tabby and roving, it looks really textural. Let's get that guy out of there. So I'm just poofing it down, tucking it in. So you can see roving is really great because it's almost like Play-Doh, like wool Play-Doh. It goes where you stick it. So I have this whole bit here. Now I'm going to add this guy in. And again, I'm just tucking the ends in the back. No one needs to see what that looks like in the back. I mean, you don't look at the back of a painting. Or at least I don't. Maybe you guys do. You see? You pop it through. In this case, I kind of want to cover those warp threads. So I'm going to do a little bit of sumac. And I'm literally just wrapping this roving around the threads. And in this case, I'm going back to tabby right here, and I'm going to go back and forth. And you can really play around with filling in gaps and placing color. You can do this with yarn as well as fiber. So you can see I'm really just, I think I want a little bit of green here, so I'm just going to pop that in. And then let's take some, oh, I have one more roving colorway that I think maybe that's the same colorway, maybe it is. In this case, I'm going to strip it finer. With roving, you can just separate it and pull it out. So now I have a thin piece and I have a thick piece. And in this case, I'm going to start with the thick piece over here. I think it must be the same colorway, or it's really close. And I'm going to do a bit of tabby. Because I really, what I'm looking at now is placing the colors where I want. I want a little bit of green here. So if you can see, roving smushes, but so does yarn. So you can smush or draw out your yarn and make it look however you want. There we go. I wanted that little bit of green to show up. So I'm twisting my roving so I can really place the colors where I want them to be. And you do this with, especially if you are working with fingering held together with other things. You could hold fingering next to super bulky. You could hold different weights together. In this case, I kind of want that dark to pop, so I'm just going to do a little sumac right there. No one will know the difference. I'm going to do a little more. And smush it. The very technical term of smushing. Now I'm going to use my thin guy here. I'm going to finish it up. I'm going to do more sumac, backing and forthing, to really fill in these last gaps. You can see why when you get to this very end and you have a lot of space between your warp threads, a super bulky, yarn held together, roving, these are all great to cover these up, which is why I like to work from finer to bulkier. It's a little bit easier. And obviously the bulky just fills in. I don't like this one warp thread here. So what I'm going to do is adjust my roving so I don't see it. You get, again, you can do that with yarn too. Okay. So here's my purple and green and teal and rainbow. I was initially thinking I was going to have more rainbow, but I really like how these look. Look at the back. It's a mess. Shove it all in. You can use a crochet hook. You can use a needle. You can tuck things underneath. Tuck it under the roving. Tuck the roving into itself. Or you can just leave it. So I have that. And then I'm going to get, this is the finishing part, and this is my favorite part, because all I need to do, see which side is going to go up. I like this side up. Pop on my outside hoop. Well, let's make sure my yarn is tucked under. Oh my goodness, why is it not? There we go. Tuck all of your bits of yarn under, pop on your hoop, tighten it. Do your last zhuzh, and voila, finished. See the edge? You don't see any of your warp. Your weave is done. And you can, again, you can zhuzh it and say, okay, you know what? I want to see a little more teal. Voila. So hopefully that was helpful. Sorry I ran over, right? There we go.
Cool.
Sorry my computer died. Was not expecting that. But I hope you guys had a great wool walk. I hope this demo was helpful for you. I hope that you guys all try to do your own circle weave soon. And don't forget, there's still like a couple hours left in the wool walk, so you can check out Yarny. You can check out the other stores. Depends on what you want. But anyway, I'm Jen. Make sure you follow us on Facebook, on Ravelry, and if you haven't been to the store, pop in. We're at 127 Watchung Avenue. All right, thanks guys.
Beautiful work, Jen.